There are some seats over here if you want to sit or not. Stay by the door. You can run away. It's easier that way. It won't be awkward. I see you. It's all good. Okay, let's get started. My name is David Duccini, and I'm going to do the bulk of the presentation. I have my attorney, Zach Robbins, here. His one job and one job only is to keep me out of Club Fed. But Zach is actually he's a blockchain fan, and we've been collaborating on my new venture, Silicon Prairie Online, which is a Minvest registered crowdfunding portal, and I'll be happy to talk about that at any point. Just come find me. So this is a presentation I've given a couple times. It's originally titled Blockchain 2.0, Bitcoin and Beyond, but Zach thought we should have some more punch to the title. So I thought maybe blockchains are coming, look busy, but forewarned is forearmed. So we'll do a quick overview here. What is a blockchain? A brief history of Bitcoin. How does a blockchain get built? How does it get verified? The weaknesses of the technology. The value, the current applications as we know it today, a lot of the currency stuff, the future apps, which is, I think, the more interesting conversation, and then Q&A. So real quick, so I've been a serial entrepreneur since 16, and I do mean I sold my first commercial piece of software based on an Apple II. It was not Oregon Trail, but I've been, that's where my love affair with computing came about. I was playing Oregon Trail in the library. The program crashed. The librarian came over and said, well, I think you type list or run to start it. And by type list, I saw all the magic code go screaming by. I was like, oh, the man behind the curtain. So coding since 1980 in every language. I've written some. I wrote a BBS from scratch, and that's where I actually learned. I fell in basically into security because the bulletin board I wrote got broken into because someone was clever and hit Control-C and broke my program. And so then I had to go and learn assembly language to do keyboard input stuff, which I think is interesting because we're still dealing with keyboard input or input sanitization sorts of problems. So got some degrees from some local schools. These are some of my hobbies. Enough about that. So, simply defined, a blockchain is little more than a distributed, secure log file. So, despite all the magic and all the secret sauce, and you can sprinkle some blockchain on some stuff and maybe make a bunch of money, at the end of the day, it's nothing more than a distributed, secure log file. And in a lot of ways, the currency was the first sort of demonstrable use of this technology. So, Bitcoin fundamentally is a protocol, and this is true. So, all Bitcoin is blockchain, but not all blockchain is Bitcoin. Right? Make sense? It's a protocol that supports a decentralized, pseudo-anonymous, peer-to-peer currency, or moving tokens around. We can swap out currency for tokens. It's a publicly disclosed linked ledger of transactions stored in what's known as a blockchain. We'll talk about what the blockchain is here in a second. There's a reward mechanism built into it. It acts like a true scarce token, so it's actually deflationary. It was first announced on Halloween in 2008, actually, by the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto. Him, her, or they. There's lots of theories about who that person is. My money is on Hal Finney, if anybody knows who Hal is. He's currently sitting on ice in cryogenic suspension. He was the first person to receive coins from Satoshi Nakamoto. And of course, now that he's on ice, he can't really talk about it. So some of the features of Bitcoin, it's essentially deflationary. It's nearly infinitely divisible. So even though there's only 21 million Bitcoins that will ever be in existence, a good chunk of them are sitting on hard drives in landfills at the moment, and they will probably likely never be recovered. But because it has 8 decimal places of resolution, you can in effect basically shift the decimal place over. So if anyone's old enough to remember the Mexican peso crisis of the 80s, what did? They shift the decimal place over. So 10 became 1. And so it'd be very easy to essentially create, there's essentially unlimited Bitcoins or bits of coin available in the economy. Nominal transaction fees are paid. The network is having some challenges at the moment, but it's true today that it costs the same amount of money to send 1 million as it costs to send 1 penny. So it's not a very smart model, and that's why I don't think Satoshi was actually an economist. Consensus-driven, no central authority. This is the key element that makes the blockchain what it is. It is like the honey badger of money. You cannot kill it, and because as long as there's 2 copies or 3 copies of the ledger out there, you can arrive at consensus to find out what is the truth. It's counterfeit resilient, and you cannot add coins arbitrarily, and you cannot double spend them. That's the whole feature of the way the network works. Non-repudiation, so gone baby gone. So unlike a credit card, if you send your coins someplace, you have nobody to appeal to get them back. There's no bank that can give them back to you. It's as if you were, carrying gold around with you essentially and got robbed. So It started, as I mentioned, Satoshi Nakamoto, 2008. These are some of the fun facts about when the domain was registered, when the Genesis block, that's the first one that kicks off the file, was created, and then the first transaction on January 12th to Hal Finney. So why does it have value? The old adage is the worth of a thing is the price it will bring. It has value because people perceive it as valuable, right? That's really fundamentally, that's all there is to it. There's nothing backing it other than the fact that you have transactions and you've got essentially a bunch of exchanges that show that and demonstrate that it's actually worth something. And there's a lot of features built into it that make it valuable, and that's why people perceive that it has value. So there's an $18 billion market cap. I have not updated this slide as of today. Bitcoin is quite volatile. It's trading around 900 at the moment, but you can go to CoinMarketCap and see it's the big gun in the room currently. But there are other chains that are coming up. Ethereum, we'll talk about that in a bit. And then the bulk of the coins that have been created are clones or brand-only coins. Most of them have no value. When you go and actually look at the code, you'll find that a good chunk of them are being produced by the same 12 people all over the planet, with a concentration in Hong Kong and in the former Soviet Republic. So there's a lot of pump and dump scams. At the end of the day, most of those coins are fighting over the original Bitcoin. They're all pegged to Bitcoin on some exchange basis. Some actually have exchanges that you can trade cash for, but by and large, they're all fighting for the original Bitcoins. So let's talk about the decentralized nature of it. The digital wallet operates in a peer-to-peer mode. There are no central servers. Now, there certainly are seed nodes around the planet. When the wallet first kicks up, it goes out and finds and starts talking to other wallets. In the early days, that was with the IRC network. That's now been changed over to a DNS-based system. And your wallet does keep track of all the wallets it ever talked to, and it will try periodically to reconnect to those wallets. It's kind of fun to watch how chatty the protocol is. In fact, the protocol that drives it's called Gossip, in fact. So it'll synchronize with the network. It's now, I think, just over 100 gigabytes. It's nothing you're going to download on your mobile phone. Unless you enjoy burning up your data plan. But fortunately, there are mobile wallets that don't require having a copy of the ledger. And you can go read about the Gossip protocol. So how does it work? Math and science. So there's a flow. So essentially, it acts like a copy of an Excel spreadsheet. We all want to participate with a blockchain. We all have a copy of the spreadsheet. When one person makes a transaction, we record that, we tell it to our neighbor, and that neighbor tells it to their neighbor, and so on and so on and so on. And then we use cryptography to determine, did this input come from the right place? Did they have the authority to sign it and send it to this other address? And then there's a reward mechanism for vetting all the transactions that I'll talk about here in a second. So this is an interesting feature about it. It's pseudonymous because it uses public keys to send transactions to. So it's transactions can go in just like with public key. You can encrypt something with a public key, and then in theory, only the person with the private key can decrypt it. It is pseudo-anonymous because it's based on pseudo-random numbers, and if you think you're going to be anonymous, you don't understand what pseudo means. So there's and because all the transactions are identified, the best place you're going to get caught is at any given exchange, right? This is why criminals think that Bitcoin is an ideal sort of mechanism for doing bad things. Fundamentally, you've got to convert that thing back into something else, and that's where they're always going to catch you, is at the exchange. So they're just like Swiss bank accounts to some extent. Coins are sent by broadcasting the transaction. They're not really sent. I mean, they don't really move anywhere. I mean, the ledger has it, but it feels like you're sending. And then there's some other features too where you can have, N of M parties. And so the beautiful thing about this is that you could have a transaction that required 2 out of 3 people to sign it, or 3 out of 5 people to participate. So it has some security features that you don't have with current other kinds of currencies. Public ledger, again, that's the whole point of the blockchain. What makes it a chain is that this block here, there's a hash that gets created from that block. That hash then gets incorporated into the subsequent block, which means that after a period of time, it becomes really hard to unwind transactions, right? Because as a block is added on to the ledger, it incorporates bits and pieces of the previous block. And so essentially you have this threaded thing building up over time. And so that's why it's really hard to unwind any transaction. In fact, the way the design of the Bitcoin anyway is that you have to have 6 blocks to be considered a confirmed transaction. Now, again, that's just a feature of Bitcoin. Lots of chains do things slightly differently. Don't have time to watch this, but I will make the slides available. Here's a simple video that kind of explains Bitcoin at a high level. So how do we arrive at consensus? So although the accepted chain can be considered a list, the blockchain is really best represented with a tree. The longest path represents the accepted chain. So what we're interested in is, we're interested in building a block. The bigger block always wins the given round. And actually at this point now, it's not even a problem because all the blocks are technically full. So in Bitcoin, there's a process known as mining. Mining does not necessarily apply to every given blockchain. Originally, the original wallet could participate. It's no longer energy efficient or even feasible to mine Bitcoins on a regular computer. Mining involves attempting to find a numerical value known as a nonce that when combined with the open transactions can be hashed into a value that satisfies a certain difficulty. So this is based on, and there's obviously, you've probably heard about mining hardware, et cetera, that's been built since then. So Hashcash, or what I call how to pay a Byzantine general's salary. So Hashcash is the original mechanism by which Bitcoin essentially derived its problem. And so part of the solution here, the reason that the mining exists is to create an artificial cadence. So Bitcoin's design had the design that they wanted to produce a block on average every 10 minutes. Well, in a global network, we know that time synchronization is actually a hard problem. So not even having any sort of authenticated source of time turns out to be a real hard problem. But this hashing solution can predictably produce an event every so often. And so in the case of Bitcoin, it's every 10 minutes. So what you do is you try and pose a problem that says, I'd like you to take this number or take this bit of data and then go find me a number that when you combine the two together will create a hash of a given pattern, right? So creating a hash is pretty simple, right? Does everyone know what a hash is? You throw data in, you get a thing out. So if you've seen MD5, SHA-1, that kind of stuff, that's a hashing function. And so that's pretty easy, but to get a hash that matches a certain pattern, that's actually difficult. Well, it's not really difficult, it can be done with brute force, but say I take this file, these letters ABC, and I add 1 to it, and then is the output, does it begin with a 0 or 2 zeros or 3 zeros? And so I keep spinning that number until I find one that satisfies the challenge of the problem. And originally Hashcash was designed as a throttling mechanism for anti-spam. It's quite interesting. This is generally called proof of work. I call it proof of waste because we're burning up a lot of energy right now trying to keep the network secure. The role of hashing. So some of the fun stuff about hashing. Okay, so here's an example. You can see how hashing, when the input changes, ABC versus AB capital C, the output is completely different, but the size is essentially the same. That's part of the role. So you can go in, you can take any string in and get the hash. You can't take the hash normally and go back unless you build massive tables that do that. So proof of waste, it's publicly audible cost function, can be efficiently verified by any third party. So it might take a long time to find that number that satisfies the problem, but you can instantly calculate based, once you know what that number is and the input, you can go back and say, yeah, that satisfies the challenge. And again, all this mining stuff, it's all artificial. It's only there to produce a block every 10 minutes in the Bitcoin space. So there are lots of other alternative ways of securing the chain. We'll talk about that. Probabilistic cost is how we get it every 10 minutes. It's really a lottery in a way. I call it Hashcash lottery. It's straightforward, but not challenging. And this talks about some of the details around getting it, the payout. So why is it worth mining? Because at the time, new coins were coming into the economy. So at the outset, 50 new coins were being kicked out. They were not, well, I mean, they were worth pennies at the time when it first started. Now they're worth $900 a piece. And then over time, the reward has been dropping, and so the power cost to mine is prohibitive. The theory is that over time, the fees would essentially replace the payout, and that would be worth competing for. Confirmation exists when your transaction's added to the chain, and then when you get so many extra blocks added on, it's considered confirmed. There's a video on mining if you're interested. Oops. Sorry about that. I guess the clicker doesn't count as keystrokes. Okay, so why does 51% matter? When does 1 plus 1 equal 3? Anybody?
Large values of 1.
That's pretty close. So when everybody says it does, right? So in the case of Bitcoin, consensus goes to the chain with the highest number of transactions in the block. Now, in Ethereum practice, several large mining pools have generated 6 blocks in a row, and this is critical because this is where you could essentially get a double spend. If you could essentially try and spend the coin and then bury that transaction in 6 blocks, it would be considered valid. And there have been several times, it's not happened recently, but there have been times where large pools have generated 6 blocks in a row and could have mounted a double spend attack. And you can purchase and exchange them. So let's talk about some of the other uses. How are we doing time real quick here? I'll make the slides available. I want to get into the good stuff anyway, since Bitcoin is kind of boring. I think it's boring anyway. But so let's talk about some other uses of blockchain technology. Right? So registries, authoritative systems of record, directory services, timestamping, counterparty exchanges. There was a wedding that was conducted and registered on the Bitcoin exchange, or on the Bitcoin ledger. I was actually there. It was a beautiful thing. They walked up to a Bitcoin ATM, they said I do, and they pushed a button. And about 10 minutes later, we got evidence that it was on the chain. Not everything should go into a permanent irrevocable ledger. Now it's going to make divorce really awkward. So Namecoin was the first fork of Bitcoin. It was designed to create a honey badger DNS system. It could be used that way. Securely records arbitrary keys and values. You can update them. It's not really an update. It's just basically creating a new version of the record added onto the chain. It also has value, coincidentally. You can go check it out. There's actually a plugin for a browser, by the way, that can use these .bit addresses. It's not really very popular, and the group behind it didn't do a lot of marketing because a lot of the stuff is just open source stuff. So the altcoins, good artists copy, great artists steal. They're basically trying to create different ways to make the maze bigger so that the mouse can, it takes a longer path to find the cheese. That stuff is not that interesting. I'm sorry for the running commentary here. I mean, maybe you find it interesting. I'm sorry. I want to get to the good stuff here. So we have lots of alternative coins out there. Proof of stake, proof of something, proof of work. There's Poet, proof of elapsed time. That's a new mechanism that's in Hyperledger. I have a coin that I spun up, which was a pro-charity coin. There's actually a session, I think, this afternoon someone's doing on creating your own cryptocurrency. I'd recommend going to that. They'll probably dive into the details. So Bitcoin 1.5, counterparty.org is an example using the Bitcoin chain of how to create counterparty exchanges. There's Mastercoin, there's Next, smart contracts, escrow-free exchange, insurance, voting, distributed autonomous organizations. Create a company that can outlive you as long as it has computers to run on. There was a recent example of a distributed autonomous organization called the DAO that was built on the Ethereum chain that somebody exploited and caused a bunch of value to get liquidated from the DAO, and then the Ethereum developers had to go and create an alternate version and sort of unwind the transaction, which created a whole bunch of consternation because the premise of it up until that point had been the code is the contract, it's inviolable, but the humans got involved and undid what was done. So there's some interesting challenges around that perhaps Zach can touch on. Identity reputation systems. I've got a proposition for a blockchain called ID coins. Identity to me is not that interesting. Reputation is everything. Right? So knowing who that person is interesting, but can you transact with them? Are they trusted by your friends or your friends of friends? My dream would be to create a world where anonymous feedback is suspicious. Right? So identity and reputation, another good particular use case. So Ethereum is sort of the first programmable blockchain. It has the idea of contracts that live inside of the chain. They get executed. Every time you send a transaction to the contract, it executes code. They're maintaining the network without any central ownership or control. Again, the idea that you could run software, the software runs everywhere or nowhere. Contracts are written in languages instantly familiar, a lot of JavaScript kind of variants on that. Hyperledger is sort of the next generation of blockchains. This is being sponsored by IBM and Red Hat. It's actually a coinless blockchain. You don't have to have a coin defined on it. You can have tokens that have no value. And you can program it in a variety of, oops, sorry about that. All right. Okay. So the things that make Hyperledger different than most of the other stacks out there, and there, as of last check, there was about 26 different stacks. This technology allows for what are called permissioned networks. You can choose who you allow to participate. Your nodes can't even connect to the network unless they're known. It uses public key infrastructure to do that. You can have confidential transactions, stuff that doesn't necessarily show up on the main chain. There's no cryptocurrency. You don't have to have one. I think there's good reasons to put value on things, because if you're going to have people participate in your network and store copies of your stuff, they should be rewarded for that. And then it is fully programmable. Some chats about the technology itself. So there's been a lot of bad press around the crypto space. I like to say guns don't kill people, but people kill people with guns. So Bitcoin's had its fair share of bad press. The Silk Road, BitInstant, MT-GOX, that was the big Japanese exchange that went out of business a couple years ago. That stands for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. It was originally started as a trade carding site. I actually have a trophy shot from that era. When I realized something was amiss, there was a high, low, and last number, right, with any kind of exchange, a high, a low, and a last. And I have a screenshot where I captured where the last was outside the bounds of the high and the low, right? And that was my tip-off that, okay, these guys are probably not really qualified to be running an exchange. And I was able to get all my, well, at the time, just a couple coins out of there before the whole thing went belly up, so. There's some resources. And I'm going to hand the mic off to Zach, I think, to talk a little bit about some of the legal side and uses of blockchain technology. And then we can also make it interactive and take questions, too.
So I'm just here to ask David questions because he is the mastermind behind all of this. And maybe like some of you, I'm just trying to scratch the surface of it. And what I'm most focused on is trying to figure out how this can be commercialized. How can we take this tech and turn it into businesses? So that's my first broad question for David is, you know, if I'm a developer and I want to learn more about the blockchain, what are some ways in which I can apply this to uses currently, you know, in existence?
Yeah, so there's a number of things you could do with, again, with the technology. I mean, first of all, if you want to get involved, I mean, just Google the term blockchain. You can. There's a enterprise blockchain meetup. I think that's being spun up in the Twin Cities here locally. That might be worth getting involved with. But the technology, the places and the applications. If you have a need for veracity in your data, right, where you need to sort of create systems of a record, a blockchain might make some sense in terms of where you would put that stuff. So, for instance, you could create a system that maintained virus signatures. For instance, you could gamify virus signatures by creating a token that represented the virus signatures, and then every time it fired, you could reward the signature writer for that. For instance, there's some places where we think that the blockchain can play some significant value in managing shareholders, for instance. So lots of small companies, those cap tables are managed in Excel spreadsheets on founders' hard drives. So they're subject to loss, they're subject to tampering with. We think by using the technology, by distributing that ledger, that you would have, not only would you have truth in the current, breakout of who owns what, but you could also then facilitate exchange.
So I think that's a good segue into your new startup, Silicon Prairie. Can you talk a bit about what that represents and how you plan to build the blockchain into it?
Sure. So it's almost like there's a shill in the crowd. Thank you, anonymous speaker. So Silicon Prairie Online is a Minvest portal operator. It's a crowdfunding site. Now that we have regulation crowdfunding that's been adopted in Minnesota. So That's not, I mean, that's interesting. Again, I'm giving this running commentary. I think the interesting thing that we're going to do is we're going to take issuers on the platform, starting this summer with our own. We're going to produce a token that represents our shareholders in the company, and then create essentially a peer-to-peer exchange model using a mobile app linked with a blockchain. So that's what we're going to do first, and then we need to work with the state to get the rules revised so that we could support an actual hosted exchange. So we want to bring liquidity and transparency to small issuers. Question?
So I'm not sure if this is a blockchain issue or a Bitcoin issue, but can you speak to the applicability of blockchain technology to environments that have high speed to data, high frequency data, thousands of transactions a second? Are there issues there?
Yeah, so that's a more of a blockchain. That's more of a Bitcoin problem, right? So because they've chosen this arbitrary cadence of 10 minutes per block. So you could, again, it depends on the type of data that you want to basically run. But there's no reason why you can't potentially get a block that's being emitted, every couple of seconds, right? So consensus doesn't have to be done by the robots. I think I'm just going to shut this thing down. So you could, in theory, have a system that manages your books in your business, and you could produce essentially one block per day. Now that doesn't require robots to sign off on it. You could actually have 3 humans push a button where they all digitally sign it at the end of the day. And so that blocking is really arbitrary. And there's no reason to have computers do it. You could have humans sign off on it too.
That also means then the mining aspect is arbitrary.
It's totally arbitrary. Totally arbitrary. That mining is just there, again, to build that cadence and then create a reward mechanism. Yeah.
In your presentation, you alluded to the fact that one of the biggest problems with cryptocurrencies is the massive waste of compute to race to the blockchain answer every 10 minutes. To me, it seems like that's going to be a problem going forward. It sounds like Hyperledger, you can make things that don't actually have value. So in that system, how does the network agree on the history?
Yeah, so the consensus mechanism is, again, there are several consensus mechanisms called the proofs. So the Bitcoin used the hash cash model, the proof of work. The second couple coins that came out, Peercoin, created a proof of stake. And so that doesn't actually take a lot of power. What you do is you demonstrate to the network by sending yourself coins. You burn up this arbitrary thing called coinage, your oldest coins. You send them to yourself, you demonstrate that to the network, and then in some coins you're allowed to give yourself interest back as part of that. And as long as everybody agrees that that was acceptable, that is enough to close the block out. So there are tons of energy efficient ways of doing it. Bitcoin just happens to be just proof of waste. So one of the models built into Hyperledger they're basically being funded by, I think it's Intel. It has a big stake, at least into the foundation. What they're doing is they proposed a proof called proof of elapsed time. By using one of their secure chips, they can go into the chip and say, go to sleep for some period of time, and then you have confidence that it actually slept for that period of time. I think it's kind of silly myself as a consensus mechanism. I'm much more interested in finding ways of using multi-party digital signatures to provide the satisfaction that the block is conforming, and then we can start a new block.
If you figure that out, let me know. That's $1 trillion.
Okay, all right. Just $1 trillion?
So there was a big decision made, I think, last week by the SEC regarding Bitcoin and ETF that the Winklevoss twins tried to put up. Can you talk a bit about that and what that may mean?
Yeah, so Winklevoss twins, you're pretty familiar with the social network? Okay, so they were big fans, still are big fans of Bitcoin, so they own a bunch of Bitcoins. And so their plan was to try to create an exchange-traded fund on one of the, I can't remember the exchange. Anyway, so they were trying to get the ability to allow people to invest in their meta fund that would be backed by Bitcoin. And so the SEC basically denied it, but for interesting reasons. So the primary reason I think that they denied it for was that there wasn't enough pricing transparency in other exchanges. So it's got high volatility, but there aren't any other exchanges around the world that really sort of rise to the level of the anti-money laundering, know your customer, AML, KYC sorts of concerns. And so it's not a hard. I don't think it's dead because there are lots of things you can buy on exchanges that don't even exist. I don't know why that Bitcoin should be picked out.
So on that same point, there have been state regulators across the country who've been freaking out about Bitcoin and blockchain and what it represents for financial transactions, taxes, as you mentioned, KYC, know your customer. Can you talk a bit about how you see perhaps government and the Bitcoin blockchain world perhaps working together to provide enough transparency so that it's not completely shut down from the state or the Fed's perspective, but that there's still enough confidence from the private space as well?
Yeah, so it goes back to that reputation piece of it and identity. And so I, can conceive of a blockchain that would have a digital notary event, for instance. So you can still have your pseudo-anonymous addresses on the chain, but I could, in theory, walk into a bank and say, okay, well, here's my public key. You can make me challenge to show that I have access to the private key. Then what they do is they insert a transaction onto the chain that says, okay, I'm a bank, and I know that this person is a real person, is a real live person. In which case, then you could then, in necessary, pop the bubble to get back if there was any kind of fraud, et cetera, in terms of re-identifying that individual. And so, anonymity is a feature of the thing. I don't know that it's going to be useful long term, especially if we're going to get to the point where the regulators are comfortable with being able to participate and watch. Now, one of the things that we're going to be able to do with this technology is we can identify the founders, the directors and officers of the organization, much like you see on like Yahoo Finance, who are the owners of the company. And then you have to wait for 6 months to find out if there was any kind of insider transactions. Well, with this technology, you would know instantly if there was any sort of insider trading. And that's the sort of thing that gets the regulators really excited.
So, yes, question.
In my experience, people as a whole suck at managing private keys. Speaking of this distributed system, I don't see just socially, a world in which we all have like our own private keys and we're good at backing them up and we don't end up with our whatever we're using for in a landfill. What's the practical solution you see going forward to that, other than backing it up in a centralized way?
Sure. Yep, key escrow, right? That's and you can also produce paper versions of your keys into QR codes, and then put them in your safety deposit box. But I think, like in our case with our issuers, since you have to be known as a shareholder by the organization, they can also offer key escrow. There's good reason in that particular case because then they could offer repudiation, right? They could unwind a transaction or make you whole. For instance, if you had lost your key. So again, it depends, but you're totally right. I mean, managing passwords is bad enough, but trying to, there are things like brain wallets, et cetera, passphrases that can help you get back to your key. But I think fundamentally, you need to have a key escrow component to it. Yep. Well, so people aren't really talking too much about it. There's a lot of interest. It's still kind of early stages. So I can share that I was involved with some patent work in a very large bank recently, and then my name will be popping out in about 12 months. So we were looking at using blockchain technology to create a rail inside of the organization. And so instead of having all these separate systems of record to have information around, say, the identity of a customer, you could essentially create this data feed service. And so multiple parts of the organization could potentially tap off of that to get information real time as there were changes going on to a particular data record. I know that in the healthcare space, there's lots of interest around keeping track of your health information, which you could do. You could, in theory, make a permissioned access system where I could basically have my medical record on my mobile device, walk in, and then give a provider temporary access to that without having to have them make copies of all my stuff. So there's a number of projects that are going on around that kind of space. People are, it's still sort of early stages, right? So it's sort of this magic toy that sort of landed on our doorstep, and we're all kind of figuring out, how we can use it. Now, again, not everything should go into a irrevocable distributed ledger, right? So that's where I'm concerned around things. People have all these ideas about putting, identity potentially in the blockchain, right? Well, just because it's in the blockchain doesn't mean it's true, right? And so I think, long term, that there are some ramifications. We have to be very thoughtful about, what we put into something that you cannot get back.
So for anyone who's ever bought a house knows how painful it is to go through the process of acquiring land. Can you talk a bit about how maybe the blockchain can work to assist with the transfer of title regarding land and public records and so on and so forth? Because I think that's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, so something we take for granted is that we've got a pretty decent system for keep track of land in the United States, but there are places in the world where land ownership is constantly disputed, and it's hard for people to prove that they own a piece of land, and that we sort of take it for granted, but that in a lot of ways gives you access to capital, right? If you're able to show that you own a piece of land, you can then take loans against it or use it as an asset, and so. The ability for using, for essentially turning like a land registry into a blockchain is a great potential use case for that, because then you could show that it properly it was transferred from one person to another over a period of time. And because the chain can store virtually any data, you could put the full geographic boundaries of the property, the geocodes, I mean the actual GPS locations, et cetera, as well as all the other sort of attachments that went with it.
So now, 99.9% of all companies are privately held. And so we have, trillions of shares sitting on Excel files that are effectively not being traded right now. I think we can all picture how this can play out, but can you provide a bit more detail into how you see all these private companies suddenly becoming more tradable? They're not public per se, but how can they make their private stocks tradable?
So part of the problem you have with a lot of small companies, especially when you get more than a handful of shareholders, is that you don't know who the other shareholders are. And so one of the things I think this technology could do for you is provide market transparency, or you could make a market from it, right? You could potentially express interest to sell or liquidate, or express interest to buy. And then, if you want to get really fancy, you turn on, Find Me on my phone and say, hey, I got to stop over at, Starbucks because somebody wants to buy my stock, right? You could, in theory, go one step further in that, that stock itself in the company. So let's say you invest in a brew pub. You could get your shares delivered, again, digitally. You could also then use those shares to pay for beer at the brewery. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't use it as a private money. In fact, I conceive of a world where you could have an ATM sitting in the brewery, and it's like, hey, I got to stop by the brewery to get some cash, right, by cashing in the stock. So I think the technology provides for market discovery.
Isn't there an issue with respect to controlling private stock? My understanding is that what I've seen in various companies is that there's a lot of concern about managing the ownership, because that affects, say, the board and various aspects of actually preventing, say, a hostile takeover.
So that's a great question, which bumps into sort of our space age approach to this, and then the practicality of managing a company. So David has been talking about, hey, how cool would it be just to have a company stock that's purely tradable, even though the company's private? And you bring up a good point, which is maybe the company doesn't want that. Maybe the company wants to prevent a competitor from purchasing its shares. So absolutely, someone like me would step in and say, pump the brakes. We need to figure out ways in which the company has the first right of refusal on any transfer of stock. And so maybe what that looks like is David builds a piece of software where once one shareholder has decided that they're going to sell that share to someone else for $50 per share, the company then is notified of that and has an hour or 2 weeks to make a decision if they are going to buy at $50. If not, then they will allow that private transaction to take place. So that's what. So right now we build those types of preventative measures into a company's operating agreement. I think the question becomes, how do we build that into more of a living, breathing operating agreement of the company? How do we take the company's documents and turn that into code? And so we're not there yet, but that's a great point that you bring up.
Well, having worked in the security area, let me warn you of something, which is that the mechanism may look the same in code. 99% of the time it isn't. I mean, law just seems to be a lot more subtle than code is.
Yeah, and to that point, David and I are going to sit down next session, and we're trying to work with a senator and a rep to figure out how we can change the state's laws to prevent a more free-flowing system of secondary transfers of stock. And so we're not quite there yet. We would love to look at other states, but frankly, there's not many other states to look at. So I'm guessing we're going to have to probably look towards Europe and elsewhere to figure out some best practices there. Speaking of changing laws, David and I have spoken in the past about how potentially constituents can vote or sort of make a decision on behalf of their representative via the blockchain. Do you want to talk about how that could work, David?
So again, with the token flow process, right? So I could, in theory, create a token, give it to you, right? And then you could then turn around and take that token and then spend it, if you will, on a given address that could represent a vote up, a vote down. And so you could, in theory, create a system where you could prevent voter fraud to some extent by first walking in, getting a token that was a paper token, and then from there expressing your voter sentiment on the chain registered. And so there's, you can also do it anonymously. You could do it with, but again, the ledger itself lends itself very well to sort of voting, recording. Using again this idea of demonstrating by sending something from one place to another to burn it up. And so right now you could vote sentiment. You could say I am for this. I'm strongly for this. You could also then create rules that say, well, I don't really know what I think, but I like the way that Chong thinks here, and so the way Chong votes, whatever, I'm just going to vote. When he votes, I'm going to vote vote that way. And so you could create all sorts of sort of smart contracts around how you want to vote, which is kind of important when it comes to companies, because a lot of times company founders or shareholders and board members disappear at times, and so getting them to vote can sometimes be very challenging when you can't get a hold of them. And so you could create essentially a proxy system that puts the proxy into a robot that you designate to vote on your behalf, but based on certain rules. So you could have essentially like the ranked choice voting inside of an organization.
Is there a question?
What do we know about the initialization / participation issue? Like, how do you, it's all very well to have a concept if you have thousands of people involved, then this will work. But obviously, when Bitcoin started, there was sort of one or a very tiny number of people. So what do we know about that process? Like how you actually get people to do this?
So what we're doing by combining crowdfunding with potentially the blockchain issuance, we're bringing people in who are becoming investors, and then they are getting their shares of the organization represented as these tokens. And so this is just a baby step. I'm just doing this to demonstrate that it's viable and possible. And if I can do it, then you all can do it.
I mean, like with Bitcoin, for example, right? Initially, it was one or a tiny number of people, and then it took off, but other pseudocurrencies didn't. So what do we know about that?
It's all marketing. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like any other part of any kind of business. How do you grow a business? It's through marketing and messaging to some extent. It's a good question. We can chat about it. How are we doing on time, by the way? Quick time check. 12. Have it until when? 12:05. Well, we'll just go until they kick us out. How's that sound? All right. Question.
What's your opinion on the zero-knowledge proof technology being introduced by coins like Zcash?
Yeah. So that's a really deep question. What's that? Tell us. Zero knowledge proofs. It's a mathematical game that in theory allows you to transfer without having necessarily the author, the same sort of digital signature stuff that goes in. Let's talk about it. Yeah.
As a follow-up, you have some pretty big thoughts on Ethereum that I think is worth sharing with the crowd. This is just your 2 cents on it, but it's a huge buzz term right now. Besides Bitcoin is probably the biggest other buzz term. Can you talk about how you feel about it and what your thoughts are and why?
Yeah, so not a huge fan of the Ethereum chain. It is about 100 gigabytes of Hello World applications at the moment. It's actually hard to sync. There's the moral hazard with them forking the chain. I think the technology is interesting. They're all proofs of concept, really. Even Bitcoin's a proof of concept. But I think that that platform in and of itself is probably, if you're thinking about starting a project, I would actually consider or encourage you looking at the Hyperledger side of things versus buying into the Ethereum chain. I think it's got some challenges and some problems. And it's not even just on the technology side. I think there's, like I said, there's some moral hazard with the founders that make it sort of tainted. I can tell you from my experience in banking, it's considered toxic, and you're probably not going to see any serious applications, from the legacy world. That's fine though, because if you're a purist, purists are okay with using things that don't satisfy the real world. I'm more of a pragmatic. I'm trying to remove the friction, if you will, and legitimize this. Today, I am currently wrestling with technology from the 70s to get my ACH stuff working so that I can take money to flow into the crowdfunding platform. Literally, COBOL, steam-driven technology I'm running up against. I'm going to try and get the friction out, but we're almost there.
So now you've raised close to 100K over the past 5 or so weeks for your own company with investment crowdfunding. Can you talk a bit about that process, what you've learned, and how you'd like to apply that nationally once you file with the feds?
Yeah, so crowdfunding is a bit of a misnomer. It's peer funding. You're largely getting your investments from people you know. It's a marketing effort again in terms of socialization. Having good advisors counts for a lot. And then again, having all the trappings of running any kind of business are still there. You still have to have a good, viable business model. You have to have something that you can communicate to your customers. I think it's going to be interesting to see as we start getting more than just breweries that are using it to see how it really plays out. So, are we at time? Thanks, appreciate it.